They believed she was invisible, that she existed only to refill goblets, lower her eyes, and vanish into shadows before anyone truly noticed her. They believed she was just another human servant in a palace where humans were disposable. But on the night an immortal king was about to surrender his throne without knowing it, a waitress broke 4 centuries of enforced silence, and spoke 5 forbidden words that nearly cost her life, and saved a vampire king from a fate worse than death. Because some traps don't kill you, they make you kneel forever. And the throne remembers, even when the king does not. The high blood hall pulsed with crimson light, not from fire or flame, but from the chandeliers themselves, each crystal vein glowing like a slow, steady heartbeat. The rhythm of power, hunger, and ancient law echoed through the vast chamber. Every vampire noble stood in perfect stillness, draped in velvet, bone, and silver, their expressions carefully schooled into masks of elegance and cruelty. This was not merely a hall. It was a stage. A place where immortals pretended civilization had tamed them, even though hunger still ruled their souls. Mira kept her head lowered as she moved across the polished obsidian floor. Her footsteps soundless, her posture small, deliberate, forgettable. She had learned long ago that survival in the Night Dominion depended on one skill above all others: invisibility. At 23, Mira knew how to pour blood wine without spilling a drop, how to avoid eye contact without appearing defiant, how to exist without being remembered, which was the only reason she was still alive. Table 7. A voice hissed beside her, sharp and thin like dry parchment tearing. Master Corvain, the head steward, materialized at her shoulder, his presence always announced by the faint smell of old ink and fear. The covenant ceremony begins in moments, he whispered, fingers tightening around her wrist just enough to bruise. You will not speak. You will not pause. You will not exist beyond your hands and the wine. Am I understood? Yes, Master Corvain, Mira replied softly, her voice trained into submission. She needed this job. The servants' quarters beneath the palace were the only shelter she had known since her grandmother died. The coin she earned kept her away from the blood farms, where humans were bred like livestock. One mistake, one moment of attention, and she would vanish into the feeding machinery that sustained the Night Dominion. No one in the palace knew that Mira was not merely a waitress. No one knew that before her grandmother died in a windowless room smelling of sage and secrets, she had passed down a forbidden inheritance, a language erased from history, a grammar of domination outlawed 4 centuries ago, the ancient blood tongue, a language so dangerous that every known keeper of it had been executed, or so the court believed. Tonight, the air felt heavier, charged, as though history itself leaned closer to listen. At the 9th bell of evening, the massive doors of black iron and carved bone swung open. Silence crushed the hall instantly. King Valor Sanguiner entered. He did not walk. He altered space around him. 7 feet of controlled lethality wrapped in midnight velvet and silver thread. His face was sharp and beautiful like a blade. His eyes the color of fresh blood beneath moonlight. Ancient, intelligent, merciless. Behind him marched 4 Bloodguard warriors, their armor etched with runes of slaughter older than cities. But it was the figure at the king's right hand that made Mira's heart stutter. Archlord Threxian Morvale. Elegant where the king was brutal. Tall and composed, silver hair pulled back from a face carved into aristocratic perfection. He was the king's most trusted advisor. Architect of peace treaties. Voice of reason. And the name her grandmother had whispered in fevered nightmares before dying. Pour for the high table, Corvain hissed, shoving a crystal decanter into Mira's hands. Move like a ghost. Disappear. She nodded and stepped forward. The blood wine shimmered dark as garnet as she poured it into King Valor's goblet. Her hands did not tremble. Her eyes stayed lowered. Discipline, control, invisibility. As the covenant scroll was unrolled before the court turns on the girl who spoke forbidden truth. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, dangerously, like ice cracking beneath the weight of something ancient and angry. Every vampire in the high blood hall stared at Mira as if she had transformed from furniture into prey. Not because she had insulted the king, but because she had reminded them of something they wanted forgotten. Fear. Not fear of death. They were immortal. But fear of losing control. King Valor Sanguiner did not move. His hand still hovered above the parchment, the quill frozen between command and catastrophe. His gaze remained locked on the small human waitress standing before him, a creature who should not have mattered, and yet had just halted the machinery of empire with a whisper. Step back, Threxian said smoothly, placing himself half a pace closer to the king. His voice was calm, reassuring, the voice of reason vampires trusted. Your Majesty, she is frightened and confused. She has likely overheard fragments of archaic court language and woven fantasy from fear. Servants do that. They imagine patterns where none exist. The court murmured softly in agreement. It was easier to believe the girl was mad. Easier than believing a trusted advisor had hidden a leash in a treaty. Valor raised one finger. The murmuring died instantly. Not you, the king said without looking at Threxian. I asked her. The rebuke was quiet, which made it worse. Threxian inclined his head, perfectly obedient, but Mira saw the tension beneath his skin, like a predator forced to pause mid-strike. Explain, Valor repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. How a servant who pours wine knows the grammar of domination. Mira's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to beg, to apologize. But her grandmother's voice rose louder than fear. Memory is the most dangerous weapon of all. My grandmother was a keeper, Mira said, forcing the words out. Before the purges. She was Iselda Corwin. That name rippled through the hall like poison in water. An elder vampire leaned forward, his ancient eyes narrowing. That woman, he said slowly, was executed for treason against the throne. No, Mira replied, her voice trembling but firm. She was executed for remembering. Gasps echoed again, sharper now. Threxian smiled, thin and cold. You tread dangerously, girl, he warned, accusing the throne's advisor of treachery. Mira did not look at him. She kept her gaze on the king. The binding phrase, she said, pointing to the parchment. The inverted oath. When spoken aloud by the sovereign, it transfers volition. It doesn't strip your power immediately. That would be obvious. It makes every command require confirmation. Every decision feel guided. She swallowed. You wouldn't notice the cage closing until years had passed. Valor's fingers tightened around the quill. You claim I would become a king in name only, he said quietly. Yes, Mira answered. A crowned servant. The blood guard shifted uneasily. Even warriors bred for obedience understood that word. Servant? Threxian laughed softly. A sound like velvet stretched over steel. This is absurd, he said, turning to the court. A frightened girl repeating half-remembered legends. The blood tongue was destroyed centuries ago. Every keeper was burned. Every text erased. Valor's eyes flicked briefly toward Threxian. And yet, the king said, she speaks it. The court stilled again. Speak, Valor commanded. Say something in this forbidden language. Mira's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. To speak the blood tongue openly was a death sentence. It was not just language. It was power. And power terrified immortals who pretended they already possessed all of it. She closed her eyes for a moment, and remembered her grandmother's hands, scarred and shaking, tracing symbols on stolen parchment. Only speak when silence becomes betrayal. Mira opened her eyes, and spoke 3 words in the ancient tongue. The sound was wrong. Not harsh. Not loud. But heavy. As if the air itself bent around the syllables. Several vampires recoiled instinctively. An elder hissed in pain, clutching his chest. Threxian's smile vanished. What did you say? Valor asked slowly. Mira's lips trembled. I said, she translated. Truth binds louder than blood. The king leaned back in his throne. Something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Threxian moved quickly now. This has gone far enough, he snapped. Guards, remove her. The blood guard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. And in that hesitation Valor spoke. No. The single word struck like thunder. The guards froze instantly. Threxian turned, disbelief flashing across his face before he masked it. Your Majesty, he said carefully. She is dangerous. Yes, Valor replied, rising slowly from the throne. She is. And that, he added, stepping down toward Mira, is why she is still breathing. The king stopped in front of her, towering, lethal, ancient. Why did you risk this? He asked quietly. You could have stayed invisible. Mira met his gaze. Because some cages are worse than death, she said. And because my grandmother died screaming in silence. Valor studied her for a long moment, then turned back to the court. This ceremony is suspended, he announced. Gasps erupted, loud and uncontrolled now. The covenant will be examined. By my order. Threxian's control cracked visibly. You cannot be serious, he said sharply. This delays peace. Valor's eyes hardened. Peace built on chains is not peace. The court erupted into chaos. Nobles whispering, elders arguing, guards shifting. But Mira barely heard any of it, because she knew what came next. Power never forgave exposure. And men like Threxian did not lose quietly. As guards escorted her away from the hall, she felt his gaze burn into her back, promising something far worse than death. Deep beneath the palace, in corridor, the price of remembering. They did not drag Mira to a cell. That would have been too honest, too visible. Instead, they led her downward through corridors that curved like veins beneath the palace. Places servants whispered about but never entered, where memory itself seemed to rot. The air grew colder with every step, not the chill of stone, but the absence of warmth, as if hope had never been invited there. Mira kept her spine straight and her gaze forward. Fear tried to hollow her out, but resolve filled the space instead, because she knew this was how power punished those who refused to bow. Quietly, away from witnesses, the chamber they locked her into was circular, smooth, and bare. No bars, no chains, no obvious cruelty, just a single obsidian chair anchored to the floor, and runes carved faintly into the walls. Listening runes, memory runes, the kind her grandmother had warned her about. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time dissolved where the walls watched you breathe. Then footsteps approached, measured and calm. Threxian entered alone. His elegance unbroken, his voice gentle, as if he were visiting a child who needed correction. "You surprised me," he said conversationally. "You were meant to pour wine and die unnoticed." Mira lifted her chin. "And you were meant to serve your king," she replied. "Yet here we are." His smile sharpened. "You think yourself brave," he said, circling her slowly. "But bravery is only admirable when it succeeds. You've delayed the inevitable. Nothing more." Mira felt the pressure begin. Not pain, but weight. A presence pushing against her thoughts. Searching. "Don't," she whispered. Threxian tilted his head. "You don't get to command anymore." The runes flared dimly, and memories surged. Her grandmother's hands, the stolen parchment, the whispered lessons spoken only at night. Mira screamed as the pressure increased. Not from agony, but from violation. This was what Threxian did. He did not kill truth. He hollowed it out. "Your grandmother begged," he said softly. She screamed. She promised silence. "And yet," he leaned closer, "she taught you anyway." Mira's vision blurred. But somewhere beyond the pain, she felt something shift. The runes stuttered, hesitated. Threxian frowned for the first time. "You've layered protections," he muttered. "Clever old woman." Above them, far away in the high blood hall, King Valor stood alone before the covenant scroll, reading, not as a sovereign, but as a prisoner reviewing the shape of his chains. He traced the sigils with his finger, noticing now what he had ignored before, the subtle redirections, the emphasis cues, the way the oath bent inward instead of outward. Something ancient stirred inside him. Anger, not rage, recognition. He summoned the eldest archivist, one who remembered the purges, one who had survived by forgetting loudly. "Translate this," Valor commanded. The archivist paled. "My lord," he whispered. "This grammar." "Yes," Valor said quietly. "Say it." "It binds the speaker," the archivist admitted, trembling. "The advisor becomes necessary." Valor closed his eyes. For the first time in centuries, he felt shame. In the chamber below, Mira gasped as the pressure suddenly lifted. Threxian stepped back sharply. "What did you do?" he demanded. Mira laughed weakly. "You forgot something," she said, blood at the corner of her mouth. "Memory isn't stored in one place. You can't erase what's been given freely." Alarms sounded faintly above. A command ripple moving through the palace. Threxian's expression darkened. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Mira replied softly. "It isn't." Guards burst into the chamber. Not his. The king's. Threxian straightened instantly, composure snapping back into place. Too late. The blood guard entered, weapons lowered toward him. By royal decree, Threxian Morvale was taken into custody. As Mira was lifted from the chair, barely conscious, she saw Valor standing at the threshold, not as a god, but as a man who had nearly lost himself. He met her eyes, and bowed. When the throne chose truth over chains, morning never truly came to the Night Dominion, but something close to it stirred the palace that day. A shift in atmosphere, a tremor that moved through stone older than kingdoms. The kind of tremor that only came when lies collapsed under their own weight. Mira woke on clean linen, the scent of herbs replacing mold and iron. For a moment, panic surged. Her body bracing for pain, for restraints, for darkness. But none came. Instead, soft lamplight illuminated a chamber she had never been allowed to enter. A healing room reserved for nobles and bloodguard. Not servants. Not humans. A healer noticed her stirring and froze, eyes wide. "You're awake," the woman whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter reality. Mira pushed herself upright slowly, her body aching but intact. "Where am I?" she asked. "Under royal protection," the healer replied, still stunned. The words felt unreal. Protection was not something humans received in the Night Dominion. Moments later, the doors opened, and King Valor Sanguiner entered alone. No guards, no advisors, just the king, ancient and terrible, and now visibly changed. He stopped several paces away, studying her with a gaze no longer sharpened by hunger, but by something heavier. Responsibility. "You should be dead," he said quietly. "Yes," Mira answered. "So should my grandmother." Valor inclined his head slightly. "I was blind," he admitted. The word sent a shock through the room. Kings did not admit blindness. Not in public. Not in private. "I trusted convenience," he continued. "I trusted comfort. And nearly surrendered my will." He met her eyes fully now. "You saved my throne." Mira shook her head weakly. "No," she said. "I saved your choice." Valor exhaled slowly. That distinction mattered more than she knew. Hours later, the high blood hall filled again. But this time, the air was not ceremonial. It was electric with reckoning. Every noble was summoned. Every elder present. And at the center of the hall, bound in silver sigils, kneeling where kings once stood, was Threxian Morvale, stripped of titles, stripped of elegance, stripped of the illusion of indispensability. The court watched in stunned silence as Valor ascended the throne. "This gathering is not for celebration," the king announced. "It is for truth." A ripple of unease spread. Truth had always been dangerous here. "For centuries," Valor continued, "we have claimed dominance through strength. Yet we allowed control to seep in through complacency." He gestured toward Threxian. This advisor used forbidden grammar to bind his sovereign. Not for peace, but for possession. Gasps erupted, some in shock, some in fear, some in guilt. Threxian laughed bitterly. "You needed me," he sneered. "You were safer with chains you didn't feel." Valor descended the steps slowly, stopping before him. "No," the king said, voice steady. "I was weaker. And weakness is not made safer by surrender." He turned to the court. This crime was exposed by a human servant. The word servant echoed sharply. "One you taught yourselves not to see." Mira stood at the edge of the hall, escorted but not restrained. Her presence sent murmurs through the crowd. "She spoke a language you erased," Valor continued, "because her grandmother remembered when the court chose silence." An elder rose shakily. "You would honor a human over ancient blood," he protested. Valor faced him without hesitation. "I will honor truth," he replied, "wherever it survives." The judgment was swift. Not execution. Something worse for someone like Threxian. Exile from influence. Memory stripped from public record. A ghost condemned to obscurity. As he was dragged away, Threxian locked eyes with Mira. For the first time, fear flickered in his gaze. Not fear of pain, but fear of irrelevance. The court was dismissed, shaken and silent. But Valor remained standing. "One more decree," he said. All eyes turned back. "From this night forward, no human servant will be punished for speaking truth. A council of memory will be restored. And Mira Corwin," he turned toward her, "will stand as its first keeper." The hall erupted. Not in applause, but in disbelief. A human, a former waitress, elevated not through blood, but through courage. Later, beneath the palace, Mira returned to the servants' quarters one last time. She packed nothing. There was nothing she wished to carry from a life built on fear. At the doorway she paused, thinking of her grandmother, of whispered lessons and stolen hope. "You were right," she murmured. Memory survived. High above, King Valor